There is a thing that happens when you have lived long enough. The body forgets how to be young, but the hands remember everything. My hands especially. One of them more than the other. I'm sitting here in a chair that creaks when I breathe too hard, and the light coming through the window is the thin, watery kind that belongs to late afternoons in November. I have seen perhaps 80 of these November afternoons, give or take one or two that I lost track of somewhere in the middle years. My memory is not what it was. I will tell you that plainly, because I think honesty costs less than pretending. But there are things I remember with a sharpness that surprises even me. The smell of machine oil and wet wool, the sound of 100 looms running at once, the feeling of standing on a stone floor for 12 hours until your feet stop being feet and become something else entirely, something that simply hurts. I was born in the spring of 1843 in a town in Massachusetts that smelled of river water and wood smoke for most of the year. My father worked at a sawmill. My mother took in mending. There were 5 of us children, and I was the third, which meant I was neither the eldest who carried responsibility nor the youngest who was held a little longer. I was simply in the middle, watching how things worked, learning the weight of ordinary days. By the time I was 11, I understood that our house ran on a kind of arithmetic that had no room for error. Every coin counted. Every hour of daylight had a purpose. My mother did not sit idle. I never once in my childhood saw her sit idle. And I think that shaped something in me before I had words to name it. Work was not a choice in the way people now seem to think it is a choice. Work was the structure underneath everything, the way bones are the structure underneath skin. Without it, you simply fell. When I was 14, my father arranged for me to begin at the Hargrove Cotton Mill, about 2 miles from our house along the river road. It was the spring of 1857. I remember the morning he walked me there, because the mud was deep from the April rains, and he held my elbow on the worst stretches of the road so I would not lose a boot. He did not say much. My father was not a man who spoke in long sentences. But when we reached the mill gate, he stopped, looked at me for a moment, and said, "Be careful of the machines," that was all. "Be careful of the machines." I did not fully understand what he meant. I thought he was being a father, speaking the way fathers speak when they cannot say what they actually feel. I thought he meant be careful in the general sense, the way you tell a child to be careful crossing a road. I did not yet know he meant it exactly and literally, and with the particular weight of a man who had worked with machinery his whole life and had seen what machinery could do when a person stopped paying attention for even a fraction of a second. The mill was 3 stories of red brick, and it sat at the edge of the river so that the water wheel could draw power from the current. Standing outside it for the first time, I remember thinking it was the largest thing I had ever been close to. Not the tallest. The church steeple was taller, but the largest in the sense of presence, in the sense of weight and sound and purpose. Even from the yard, you could feel the vibration of the machines through the soles of your shoes. A low, constant trembling, like something enormous breathing. Inside was another world entirely. The noise was the first thing. It did not build gradually. It struck you the moment the door opened. A wall of sound so dense it seemed to have physical mass. The clatter and slam and rhythmic thunder of the looms filled every cubic inch of the room, bounced off the brick walls, and settled into your chest like a second heartbeat. Women shouted to each other in short bursts, cupping hands around mouths, and still half of it was lost. You learned to read lips. You learned to understand a raised eyebrow, a pointed finger, a tilt of the chin. You learned a whole second language made of gestures, because words could not survive in that air. The smell was machine oil and damp fiber, and something sharper beneath it that I later learned was the sizing they used to stiffen the threads. It sat at the back of your throat. By the end of the first week, you stopped noticing it, which I now think is one of the stranger things the body does. It simply decides that a thing is normal and erases it from awareness, whether or not the thing deserves to be erased. The floor was long and low-ceilinged, lit by tall windows on both sides, and in the middle of the day the light fell in dusty columns through the lint that floated constantly in the air. That lint, it settled on your shoulders, on your eyelashes, in the folds of your collar. At the end of a shift, you shook out your clothes, and a small cloud rose around you. Some of the older women tied cloth over their mouths and noses. Others did not bother. I was 14 and did not yet understand which category of person I was going to be. There were perhaps 60 women on my floor that first morning, ranging from girls not much older than me to women who seemed ancient but were probably no more than 40. Age moved differently in a mill. The work had a way of advancing the years, pressing them forward faster than they wanted to go. My overseer was a man named Mr. Alcott, short, with a gray beard kept very neat, which always struck me as a small vanity in an otherwise rigid person. He showed me to my station, gestured at the loom I would be learning, and said that a woman named Ruth Hadley would teach me what I needed to know. Then he walked away. Ruth Hadley was 31 years old and had been at the Hargrove mill since she was 15. She looked at me the way experienced people look at beginners, not unkindly, but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone measuring how much work this is going to be. She said, "Watch my hands first. Always watch the hands." Ruth Hadley's hands were extraordinary things. I do not mean that as a compliment exactly. I mean it as a simple observation, the way you might observe that a river runs fast or a stone is heavy. They were the hands of someone who had spent more than half her life in conversation with machinery, and the machinery had answered back in its own way. The knuckles were enlarged. 2 fingers on her right hand bent slightly at the middle joint in a direction they were not born bending. The skin across her palms was thick and pale, like old candle wax, and yet they moved with a fluency that I had never seen in any other pair of hands before or since. Quick, precise, utterly without hesitation. She could thread a shuttle in the dark, she told me once. I believed her completely. She did not waste time on sentiment. That first morning, she stood beside me at the loom and walked me through the parts the way a carpenter might walk you through the parts of a house. Not because the house is beautiful, but because you need to know where the walls are before you can live in it safely. The breast beam, the beater, the shuttle race, the heddles, the treadles beneath your feet. Each part had a name, and each name had a function, and each function connected to every other function in a chain that produced at the end of it cloth. Plain, sturdy cloth, mostly, the kind used for shirting and sheeting in the linings of coats, nothing decorative, nothing anyone would call lovely, but cloth that people needed, and that fact mattered to Ruth in a way she expressed not through words, but through the seriousness with which she treated every step of the process. "Watch the tension of the warp threads," she told me. "If it drops unevenly, the cloth comes out wrong and you will have to answer for it. Watch the shuttle. It moves faster than you think it moves, and your hands need to be clear of its path before it crosses, not after. Feel the rhythm of the beater." The loom has a rhythm the same as breathing has a rhythm, and once you find it, your body will follow without being told. But until you find it, pay attention to nothing else. I tried to pay attention to nothing else. It was harder than it sounds. The noise alone was a constant distraction, pressing against your thoughts from all sides, making concentration into a physical effort. And there was so much to watch: the threads above, the shuttle crossing, the treadles beneath your feet, the cloth slowly accumulating on the beam in front of you. The first time I tried to manage it all at once, I made 3 mistakes in the space of 10 minutes, and Ruth had to stop the loom to correct them. She did it without irritation, which I respected more than I would have respected patience delivered through clenched teeth. The other women on the floor observed me the way a group of people observe a new addition to a household, with interest that they mostly kept to themselves, except in the brief windows when Mr. Alcott was at the other end of the room. There was a woman named Clara who worked 2 looms down from me, and who had a habit of humming without sound, just moving her lips, which I found strange until I understood it was how she kept the rhythm in her head during the long stretches when the noise was too overwhelming for anything else. There was an older woman, Mrs. Fenwick, who brought her lunch wrapped in a piece of brown paper and ate it standing up, because she said sitting down at midday made the afternoon harder to get through. There was a young woman, perhaps 16, named Dora, who had only been there 3 weeks longer than me, and who looked at the looms with an expression that I can only describe as determined resignation, as though she had made a private agreement with the place and intended to honor it whether she liked it or not. I understood that feeling quickly. Within the first month, I understood it thoroughly. The days were long in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. We began at 5 in the morning and finished at 7 in the evening, with 30 minutes at midday. 14 hours on your feet, breathing lint-filled air, maintaining the concentration that the machines demanded. By the time you walked home, your body had a heaviness to it that went beyond simple tiredness. It was as though the day had deposited something in your bones, some residue of effort that sleep only partially cleared. You woke in the morning still carrying traces of the day before, and yet there was something in it that I did not expect, a kind of order that I found, if not comforting, then at least reliable. The loom did not change its nature from one day to the next. It asked the same things of you every morning with perfect consistency, and gradually, over weeks, I felt myself meeting those demands more easily. The shuttle's speed stopped startling me. The rhythm Ruth had spoken of began to settle into my muscles without conscious effort. I stopped watching my hands and started watching the cloth. Ruth noticed. One afternoon in late July, about 3 months after I started, she came and stood beside me for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "You've found the rhythm." I did not look up because you learn not to take your eyes off the work for anything short of an emergency. But I felt something in my chest that I did not quite have a name for then. Something between pride and relief, the way you feel when a person whose judgment you trust tells you that you have done a thing correctly. That evening, walking home along the river road, I thought about what my father had said on the morning he brought me to the gate. Be careful of the machines. I'd been careful. I'd been learning. I thought perhaps that was enough. I was 15 years old, and I did not yet know what careful truly meant. The years inside a mill do not pass the way. Years pass outside one. Outside, time moves in seasons. You feel the shift from cold to warm. You notice the days lengthening and shortening. You mark the year by the garden and the harvest and the first frost on the window pane. Inside the mill, time moves in shifts. It moves in the repetition of the same gestures performed thousands of times until the gestures are no longer something you do, but something you simply are. You do not watch the seasons from a loom. You watch the cloth accumulating on the beam in front of you, and one day you realize that 3 years have passed, and you know this not because you felt them go, but because someone mentions a date, and you count backward and arrive at a number that surprises you. By the time I was 17, I had 2 looms. By 18, I was one of the steadier workers on the floor, which meant Mr. Alcott gave me the harder assignments, the tighter weaves, the orders that required more precision in the threading, the work that a newer hand might ruin and that the mill could not afford to have ruined. I did not receive more money for this distinction, which I understood was the nature of the arrangement. The mill gave you wages. What you gave the mill was everything else. Ruth was still there. She had been promoted to a kind of informal lead position, nothing with an official title, nothing that appeared in any ledger, but everyone on the floor understood that she was the person you went to when the machine behaved strangely, or when a new girl needed guidance, or when a disagreement needed settling quietly before it became something Mr. Alcott had to involve himself in. She was good at all of these things. She had a way of addressing a problem directly, without drama, that I tried to learn and never quite mastered in the same way she had it. The pace of the mill increased around 1860, which was when the ownership changed hands. The new owners were a family from Boston, men I never saw in person but whose decisions arrived on the floor in the form of new quotas posted each Monday morning on the board near the entrance. The numbers climbed steadily, week by week, in increments small enough that no single increase felt like an outrage, but large enough that after 6 months we were all producing noticeably more than we had been. The machines ran longer. The maintenance intervals shortened. There were weeks when a loom that had been making a particular grinding sound for 3 days was left running because stopping it meant lost production, and the calculation had been made somewhere above our heads that the risk was acceptable. Clara, the woman who hummed silently to keep her rhythm, left in the spring of 1861. She did not make an announcement. One morning, her station was empty, and by afternoon, a girl I did not know was being shown the machine by one of the newer floor women. That was how departures happened at the mill. No ceremony. The loom simply had a different pair of hands at it the next day, and the cloth continued accumulating, and the shuttle continued crossing, and the rhythm continued without pause, because the rhythm was not about any particular person. The rhythm was about the machine. Mrs. Fenwick retired that same year at the age of 53. She had been at Hargrove for 22 years. On her last day, she ate her lunch, standing up as she always had, wrapped in brown paper as it always was, and at 7 o'clock, she put on her coat and walked out without looking back. I watched her go and felt something I could not precisely name. Not sadness exactly, more like the recognition of something true and slightly cold, that this place would not remember her, that the mill did not hold the shape of the people who had stood inside it. They passed through, and it continued, unchanged. I was not unhappy during these years. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to paint those days as entirely grim, entirely endured, rather than lived. That would not be accurate. There were mornings when the light came through the tall windows at an angle that turned the floating lint into something almost golden, and the sound of the looms, which on bad days felt crushing, on good days felt like a kind of music, rough and mechanical, but with a pulse that your body understood. There were friendships formed in that compressed space, built out of shared tiredness and shared small jokes shouted over the noise. There is the deep satisfaction of work done correctly, which is a satisfaction unlike most others because it is entirely without pretension. But the pressure of those years was real, and it was cumulative. You could feel it in the way the women moved, the slight forward hunch that came from years at the loom, the way older hands on the floor walked carefully, distributing weight in particular ways that protected joints that had given much of their ease to the machines. You could hear it in the coughs that ran through the floor each winter, thickened by years of lint-laden air. You could see it in the faces of women who had arrived at 15 with a kind of openness to them, and by 30 had something more guarded in its place, something that had learned to hold its expectations very close to the chest. I noticed all of this the way you notice weather, as a condition of existence, not as something to be argued with. What else was there to do but continue? The arithmetic of our household had not changed. My younger brother had begun at the mill by then as well, and my mother's eyes were worsening, which meant her mending brought in less than it once had. There was no version of events in which I stopped, so I continued. I came in at 5. I stood at my looms. I watched the shuttle cross. I felt the rhythm in my bones, and I told myself that careful was a habit I had built and maintained and could rely upon. I was 20 years old and still believed that. The morning of the 14th of March, 1863, began the way most mornings began, which is to say it began badly in the small, ordinary ways that you do not think of as warnings, because they happen too often to be warnings. The fire in the kitchen stove had gone low overnight, and the room was cold when I woke. The water in the wash basin had a skim of ice at the edge. My younger brother Thomas had taken the better pair of wool socks without asking, which meant I wore the ones with the worn heel, and I felt that worn patch against the stone floor with every step I took for the entire walk to the mill. Small irritations, the kind that accumulate in the first hour of a day and make you feel that the day is already slightly against you, though not in any way you could point to and call a reason for concern. I remember the sky that morning, a flat, pale gray, the color of river ice, with no suggestion of sun anywhere behind it. The kind of sky that does not threaten storm but offers nothing either. Simply a lid of cloud pressed down over everything, making the world feel smaller and closer than usual. The river road was hard underfoot, the mud frozen since the night before, and my breath came in short white bursts that disappeared quickly into the cold air. I walked fast because the cold demanded it, and because I was already running a few minutes behind my usual time. Ruth was already at her station when I arrived. She almost always was. She had the particular discipline of someone who treats punctuality not as a virtue, but as a basic form of respect for the work itself. She glanced at me when I came in, registered my arrival, and returned to what she was doing. That was her greeting on most mornings, and I had long since stopped expecting anything warmer. It was not coldness, it was simply efficiency, and I had come to understand it as a kind of affection expressed in the only currency she readily spent. The floor filled in around me. The familiar faces taking their familiar positions, the machine starting up in sequence, the noise building from a low rumble to its full roaring density over the course of perhaps 10 minutes, until conversation became impossible and the world narrowed to the loom in front of you and the woman on your immediate left or right, whose presence you registered through peripheral vision rather than through any actual exchange. My looms that morning were running a medium-weight shirting cloth on a tight schedule, an order that had been behind since the previous week when one of the warp beams had needed replacing. Mr. Alcott had been specific about the urgency when he had come to my station the previous Friday afternoon. He had not raised his voice. He never raised his voice. But he had made the arithmetic of the situation very plain. The order needed to be complete by the end of the week, or the mill faced a penalty from the buyer. I had nodded and said I understood, because I did understand, and because there was nothing productive in saying anything else. So that morning, I was working at a pace slightly above my usual rhythm. Not reckless. I want to be precise about this because I have thought about it many times over many years, and I am still not sure exactly where the line was. Not reckless, but pressed. There is a particular quality to work done under pressure that is different from work done at a natural pace, and the difference is not always visible from the outside. From the outside, it can look the same. The hands move, the shuttle crosses, the cloth accumulates, but something inside the process is different. The margin is smaller. The tolerance for any deviation from the expected is reduced because you're already operating closer to the edge of what can be managed comfortably. Mid-morning, the loom on my left developed a problem with the tension on the warp beam. It was not dramatic, a gradual, uneven slackening that showed up in the cloth as a slight irregularity, a wavering in the weave pattern that would not pass inspection. I stopped that loom and spent perhaps 12 minutes adjusting the tension mechanism, which required reaching into the upper part of the frame to reset a particular bolt that had been working itself loose for several days. I had reported the bolt to the floor mechanic twice. It had not been addressed. This was not unusual. The mechanics had a long list of things to address, and they worked through it at a pace determined by their own priorities and by the judgment of those above them about what could wait. I fixed the tension as best I could. It held well enough for the moment. I restarted the loom and turned back to my second machine, which had been running unattended for those 12 minutes, within normal bounds, nothing that should have caused a problem, but I had lost the rhythm of it, the internal sense of where it was in its cycle, and I had to reestablish that feeling before I could work efficiently again. This is the part I have gone over the most carefully in my memory over the years. What happened in the next portion of the morning, and whether the sequence of it was inevitable, or whether there was a moment, a specific, locatable moment, where a different choice would have changed everything that followed. I have never been able to find that moment with certainty, and I have looked for it with the kind of attention that only guilt produces, thorough, relentless, returning again and again to the same territory, hoping that something new will reveal itself. The morning continued, the noise continued, the shuttle continued crossing, and I worked, and I was pressed, and the margin was smaller than it should have been, and I did not yet know it. There is a particular quality to the moment just before something goes wrong, and I do not mean that I sensed it coming, because I did not. I mean that in the years since, when I have returned to that morning in memory, I noticed something in the texture of the minutes just before, a tightness, a compression, as though time itself was drawing inward, the way air draws inward before a door slams. But that is memory adding shape to what was shapeless. In the actual moment, there was nothing. There was only the loom and the cloth and the shuttle crossing, and my hands doing what they had done 10,000 times before. I was clearing a tangle in the weft threads on the second loom, a small snag, the kind that appears without warning and must be cleared quickly before it compounds into something that damages a longer stretch of cloth. You reach in while the machine is running. This was the practice. This was what everyone did, because stopping the loom for every small correction was not how the work was done, had never been how the work was done, and no one above us had ever suggested otherwise. You learn the timing. You develop a sense of the machine's rhythm that is almost bodily, almost instinctive, and you use that sense to place your hands in the safe intervals between the moving parts. I had done this hundreds of times, perhaps more than hundreds. It was not a reckless act. I want that understood, not as excuse, but as accuracy. It was the ordinary practice of ordinary work in an ordinary mill in the middle of an ordinary morning. What happened was this. The tension problem on the left loom, the one I had partially repaired earlier, gave way again. Not catastrophically, just enough to cause a sound, a sharp, irregular knock that I had been half listening for without realizing it. My attention moved toward it. Not my body, just my attention, just the interior orientation of my focus, that fraction of awareness that had been keeping the rhythm of the second loom in its peripheral hold. It shifted, and in the space that shift created, my hand was a half-second behind where it needed to be. That is the whole of it, a half-second, perhaps less. The beater came forward in its arc, as it had come forward thousands of times before, as it would continue coming forward after, as it comes forward still in mills running today. It did what it was built to do, with the perfect indifference of machinery. And my hand, the left one, was not entirely clear. What followed I will not describe in the way that a person tells a story where the telling is the point. I will tell you only what is necessary to understand what the day became. There was a sound I felt more than heard, a deep, percussive wrongness that registered in my arm before it registered anywhere else. The pain did not arrive immediately. That is the strange mercy of certain injuries. The body takes a moment to understand what has happened to it, and in that moment you're still standing, still present, still a person who exists in one piece. Then the understanding arrives. I stepped back from the loom. I do not know if I did this deliberately or if my body simply moved away from the source of harm the way a hand pulls back from flame. I was aware of the machine continuing to run beside me, its rhythm uninterrupted, the cloth still accumulating, the shuttle still crossing, because the machine did not register what had happened as an event worth stopping for. Ruth was at my side within seconds. I do not know how she knew. Perhaps she saw me step back. Perhaps she heard something beneath the noise that her years of experience had trained her to recognize as different from the ordinary sounds of the floor. She looked at my hand, and her face did not change in any dramatic way. It was not that she felt nothing. It was that she was the kind of person who understood immediately that this was a moment requiring steadiness, and she provided it with the same directness she brought to everything else. She took hold of my arm with both her hands, firmly, and she said something to me. I could not hear the words clearly through the noise, but I understood the intent. Stay with me. Do not look down. Move toward the door. I moved toward the door. She stayed beside me, not letting go of my arm, and I remember the floor feeling very far away and very close at the same time, as though the distance between my feet and the ground had become uncertain. The other women on the floor saw us moving. I was aware of faces turning, of mouths opening, of the particular way that a room changes when something has gone wrong inside it. Not louder, not quieter, but differently textured. The attention of everyone present suddenly oriented toward a single point. Clara's replacement at the loom 2 down from mine, a young woman whose name I'm ashamed to say I cannot now recover, pressed her hand to her mouth. An older woman near the window made a small gesture that might have been a prayer. Mr. Alcott appeared at the far end of the floor. He was moving quickly, which was unusual for him. Even in that moment, I registered the unusualness of it, the way the mind clings to small, ordinary observations when the large things are too much to hold directly. We reached the door. The cold air of the stairwell hit me like a hand pressed flat against my face. Ruth said something again, close to my ear this time, and I heard it clearly in the relative quiet away from the looms. She said, "Breathe. Just breathe. You're still here. I was still here. That much was true. The rest I would have to learn to live with." The room they brought me to was small and smelled of turpentine and old wood, a storage room on the ground floor that had been cleared enough to hold a cot and a chair and not much else. I had passed its door every day for 6 years without ever going inside it. It had a single window set high in the wall, too high to see out of, that let in a rectangle of pale gray light from the sky I had looked at that morning on my walk to the mill, the same flat, lidded sky, indifferent as ever. Ruth stayed with me until the mill's physician arrived. His name was Dr. Hadwell, a thin man in his late 50s with a quiet, practiced manner that I found steadying in the way that competence is always steadying, regardless of the circumstances around it. He spoke to me calmly and worked quickly, and I will not detail what that hour contained, except to say that Ruth held my right hand through most of it, and that I focused on the rectangle of pale sky through the high window, and that I did not make a great noise, which I mention not as a point of pride, but because I remember deciding, at some point in that hour, that I would not, that the decision was mine to make, that in a situation where nearly everything had been taken out of my hands, that particular thing remained within them. When Dr. Hadwell was finished, he spoke to me plainly, which I have always been grateful for. He did not soften the facts into a shape they did not have. He told me what remained and what did not, and he told me what the weeks ahead would likely require, and he told me that the injury, while serious, was not one that would take my life if I was careful, and the wound stayed clean. I listened to all of this with a steadiness that I think surprised him, and that surprised me somewhat as well. I think I was still far enough inside the shock that the words arrived at a remove, like news about someone else heard from a reliable source. I understood them. I stored them. The feeling attached to them would come later, at its own pace, in its own sequence. Mr. Alcott came to the door of the room at some point during the afternoon. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He had removed it, which registered somewhere in my mind as a small acknowledgement, and he said that the mill would cover the physician's fees for the initial treatment. He said it in the tone of a man delivering information he had been told to deliver, which is to say without warmth, but also without deliberate coldness. I said thank you. He nodded once and left. That was the extent of what passed between us on the subject for the remainder of the time I knew him, which was several more years. My brother Thomas came for me in the late afternoon. Someone had sent word to the house, and he had come directly from his own shift in the lower mill, still carrying the smell of the machines on his coat. He was 17 at the time, and he was trying very hard to have the face of someone who was not frightened, and the effort of it was visible in exactly the way he did not want it to be. When he saw me, he stopped in the doorway for a moment, and then he came and sat beside me and did not say anything for a little while. Then he said, "Can you walk?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then let's go home." The walk back along the river road was slow. Thomas stayed close on my left side, not touching me, but positioned in the way that people position themselves when they are ready to catch someone if catching becomes necessary. The cold had deepened since morning, and the mud that had been frozen at dawn had stayed frozen, so the road was at least firm underfoot. The sky had darkened to the color of charcoal. Somewhere across the river, a dog was barking at something it could not reach, and the sound carried cleanly through the cold air with that particular clarity that sound has in winter, as though the cold removed something from the atmosphere that usually muffles things. I thought about very little on that walk. I am certain of this because I have tried many times over the years to remember what was in my mind during those 20 minutes on the river road, and I find almost nothing there. Not grief, not fear, not anger, not any of the things you might expect to be first in line. Mostly, I remember the sensation of walking, the effort of it, the cold air moving in and out of my lungs, and a kind of interior blankness that was not peace, but was perhaps the thing the body provides in place of peace when peace is not yet available. My mother was waiting at the door. She had been waiting since the word came, which had been hours, and the waiting had done something to her face that I had not seen in it before. She put her arms around me in the doorway and held me for a long moment without speaking. My mother was not a demonstrative woman. She had grown up in a household where practicality was the primary language, and the holding said more than anything she might have found words for. Inside, the fire had been built up and the room was warm. There was a lamp on the table, throwing its yellow circle over the wood. Outside the window, the dark had settled completely. I sat down in the chair nearest the fire and I looked at my left hand, or rather, at what was now where my left hand had been, and I let the fact of it arrive, not all at once, in portions. The way cold water enters a room through a crack in a wall, slowly, steadily, until you can no longer pretend the room is dry. The weeks that followed had a quality I have never found the right word for. Not darkness exactly, though there was darkness in them. Not stillness, though the days moved slowly in a way I was not accustomed to. The closest I can come is this. It was like learning to read again after already knowing how to read. Everything that had been automatic required deliberate thought. Everything that had been simple required planning. The body you had lived in for 20 years had become, overnight, a place with new rules, and the rules had not been provided in advance. My mother managed the wound with the careful attention she brought to all practical matters. Dr. Hadwell came twice in the first week and once in the second, and he was satisfied with how things were progressing, which I understood to mean that the worst possibilities were receding. I was grateful for this in a way that was entirely separate from any feeling about what I had lost. Gratitude and grief can occupy the same chest without displacing each other. I learned that in those weeks. The hardest part was not what people assume it was. It was not the pain, though the pain was real and had a presence that demanded acknowledgement at all hours. It was not the physical limitation, though that was also real and would require adjustment for the rest of my life. The hardest part was the idle time. I had not been idle since I was a small child. 14 years of continuous work had made idleness into something that felt not like rest, but like falling, like the ground had been removed from under a step you were already taking. I did not know what to do with hours that had no structure provided by a machine running beside me. I sat by the fire, and the hours moved around me, and I felt the full weight of my own thoughts in a way that the noise of the mill had never permitted. Those thoughts were not gentle company. I went over the morning of the 14th many times, in that chair by the fire, in the gray light of the days that followed. I went over it with the same methodical attention I had once given to the tension of the warped threads. I looked for the moment where something different could have been chosen. I looked for the error that was mine to own, distinct from the worn bolt I had reported twice and which had not been fixed, distinct from the pressure of the quota that had narrowed my margin, distinct from a practice, reaching in while the machine ran, that the mill had never prohibited and never would. I looked for my own piece of it because I needed to find something I could hold, something with edges, something that was not simply the verdict of accident. I found it eventually in the shifted attention, the knock from the left loom, the fraction of focus that moved before my hand did. That was mine, small, perhaps almost invisible, but mine. I took hold of it, and I kept it, not as punishment, but as the truth of what had happened. I have carried it since then in the particular way you carry things that are true and heavy and yours to carry. Ruth came to the house in the 3rd week. She walked the 2 miles from the mill on a Sunday afternoon and knocked at our door and sat with me for an hour by the fire. She brought a small paper of tea, which was a practical gift in the way that Ruth's gifts were always practical. We talked about the floor, about who had been assigned to my looms, about the tension problem that had finally been addressed after the accident. Addressed, I noted without surprise, immediately after and not before. We did not talk directly about what had happened, not in the explicit way. But at the end of the hour, when she stood to leave, she looked at me for a moment with an expression I had rarely seen on her face, something open in it, something that did not have the usual efficiency behind it. She said, "You were one of the best hands I ever taught." Then she put on her coat and left. I turned that sentence over for many days afterward. I'm not sure she intended it as comfort. I think she intended it as fact, delivered plainly because plain delivery was her way. But it reached me as something I needed, which perhaps is what certain things do regardless of their intention. By the 5th week, I was beginning to understand the practical dimensions of what the rest of my life would look like. Dr. Hadwell had been honest with me about this from the beginning, and I had listened. But there is a difference between hearing a thing and understanding it in your body, in the daily texture of your existence. I would not return to the looms, not to the particular work I had done, which required 2 fully functioning hands working in close coordination with fast-moving machinery. This was not a temporary conclusion. It was permanent, and it was without appeal, and it settled into me over those weeks the way the cold had settled into the storage room, slowly, completely, without negotiating. What I could do, and what I would need to find, was something else. The arithmetic of our household had not changed simply because I had. My brother's wages covered the necessities but left nothing for unexpected costs, and Dr. Hadwell's visits were not free beyond the initial ones the mill had covered. My mother's eyesight continued to worsen. The world required that I find a way back into it, and it was not going to adjust its requirements to match my circumstances. I spent the 6th week thinking about this with the same determination I had once applied to learning the loom. The problem was real. It had edges I could examine. I was 20 years old, which meant I had time. Not unlimited time, not comfortable time, but time. And I had spent 6 years learning that problems without obvious solutions were not the same as problems without solutions. I was not the same person who had walked to the mill on the morning of the 14th. That person was gone, and I did not think she was coming back. But I was still a person. That much had not changed. I am sitting in this chair now in this November light, and I am older than anyone in my family has ever managed to become. My mother made it to 67, my father to 59. Thomas lived to 71, which surprised everyone, including Thomas. I've outlasted them all by a margin that still strikes me as faintly improbable, as though some clerical error was made in my favor decades ago and has never been corrected. My left hand rests in my lap, as it always has, as it has rested in my lap through every year since 1863. I stopped being self-conscious about it somewhere in my 30s, which took longer than I expected and shorter than I feared. People look, and then they stop looking, and then they simply know you as the person you are, and the hand becomes one part of that person among many parts. At least that is how it went for me in the life I ended up building, which was not the life I had imagined at 20, but then very few lives are. What I found in the months after the accident was work as a seamstress's assistant in a dry goods shop owned by a widow named Mrs. Emmeline Proctor, who was herself missing 2 fingers on her right hand from an accident in her own youth involving a carriage door and very bad luck. She hired me within 10 minutes of meeting me, which I have always suspected was partly practical and partly the particular solidarity that forms between people who have been altered by the world and have decided to continue anyway. She taught me the parts of the trade that my one good hand could manage, and she was patient with the parts that required more adaptation. And over 2 years, I became genuinely useful to her. And over 5 years, I became something closer to indispensable. I worked for Mrs. Proctor for 11 years. When she died in 1876, she left me a small portion of the shop's inventory and enough goodwill with her suppliers that I was able to establish something modest of my own. I will not call it a success in the grand sense because that would be overstating it, but it was a livelihood. It was mine. And there is a particular kind of satisfaction in a thing that is yours, built from what you had available, that does not require comparison to larger things to justify its worth. I married late, at 34, which was considered unusual for a woman of my time, and which I considered nobody's business but my own. His name was George Whitmore, and he was a cabinet maker with steady hands and a quiet temperament that suited me well. He knew about the accident before I told him, because I told him early, because I had decided long before I met him that I would not spend energy managing other people's discomfort about my hand. He listened, asked 2 practical questions, and then said that it seemed to him I had managed my life quite competently thus far, and he did not see why that would change. I found that response more romantic than most things people say when they are trying to be romantic. We had 2 children, a daughter, Margaret, who lives in Connecticut and writes to me every second Sunday without fail, a son, Edward, who died at 9 years old from a fever that took him in the course of 4 days, which is the loss I carry above all other losses, the one that has never reduced itself to something bearable in the way that time supposedly reduces things. I do not speak of Edward often, not because I have forgotten him, but because some things are too interior for regular speech. You keep them in the part of yourself that is not available for general conversation. George died in 1904, after 30 years of marriage that were not perfect, but were honest, which I now think is the better of the 2 qualities when you can only have one. I have been alone since then, which is 20 years of solitude that I have filled with work and with Margaret's letters and with the particular occupation of an old woman who has a great deal to remember. Now, in this November light, I think about what I would say to the girl who walked along the river road in the cold dark of the morning of the 14th of March, 1863. The girl with the worn heel on her sock, and the flat gray sky above her, and the 6 years of habit and competence settled into her bones. I would not tell her to be careful of the machines, because she had already been told that, and because careful is not sufficient protection against the ordinary disasters of an ordinary life. I would tell her something different. I would tell her that the thing she is about to lose is real, and the losing of it is real, and she should not rush past it or diminish it. But I would also tell her that she is going to be surprised by herself, that the arithmetic she has always applied to problems is not going to stop working simply because the problem is herself, that Mrs. Proctor exists and is waiting, and that George Whitmore exists and is waiting, and that Margaret is somewhere in the future, like a letter already written and not yet delivered. I would tell her that a life does not have a single shape, that once broken cannot be anything else. I learned that in my bones over 60 years of evidence, and I believe it the way I believe in the cold and the river and the turning of November into December, not as comfort, as fact. The light through this window is failing now, the way it does at this hour in this season. I've been talking for a long time, and my throat is dry and the chair is creaking with every breath I draw. If you have listened this far, then you already know why I wanted this written down. Not for me. I have no use left for records, for whoever comes after, who will work hard and lose something, and need to know that the losing is not the end of the account. That is the only reason any of us tell these things. Write it down. Remember it. That is all I ask.